The city glittered below. A carpet of cold diamonds stretched out under a black sky. Up here, in the penthouse, the view was something you paid for. A lot. The air smelled of lemon-scented polish, expensive perfume, and the sharp, salty hint of caviar on tiny blinis. The party was in full swing. It was the kind of gathering where laughter was a bit too loud, where conversations were about deals and destinations, not dreams. The hostess, a woman with a sharp blonde bob and even sharper eyes, moved through the crowd like a sleek shark. Her name was Evelyn. She owned the room, the view, and, it seemed, everyone in it. Her smile was brilliant and practiced, a tool she used to cut or to charm Dot. In stark contrast to the jewel-toned dresses and crisp suits was Maya. She wore a simple, starched white shirt and a black skirt that fell to her knees, the uniform of the high-end catering company. She was in her mid-20s, with a quietness about her that made her seem almost invisible. She moved with a fluid efficiency, a ghost with a tray, refilling a champagne flute here, clearing an empty plate there. Her eyes, a warm brown, rarely lifted from her task. When they did, they didn't meet anyone's gaze. They just checked the level of wine in a glass, or scanned for a guest in need. She preferred it this way. Being unseen was part of the job. It let her observe, to listen to fragments of conversations about stock markets and private galleries, and to build a silent story for each person. The man with the loud laugh was covering up his nerves. The woman by the window, staring out, was wishing she was somewhere else. Maya understood that. She often wished she was somewhere else, too. The centerpiece of the vast living room, right before the wall of windows, was a piano. It wasn't just any piano. It was a Steinway Grand, a beast of polished ebony that gleamed under the carefully placed track lighting. It was a statue, a piece of art. No sheet music sat on its stand. Its lid was closed. It was clear it was meant to be admired, not heard. Dot as the night wore on. The noise level rose. Evelyn's voice cut above the din more frequently, her jokes tinged with a meanness that her circle accepted as her style. Maya felt the woman's gaze sweep over her a few times, like a searchlight. She kept her head down, focusing on the clinking of crystal and the murmur of voices. She was near the kitchen door, collecting a new tray of delicate tartlets, when she heard Evelyn's voice rise, clear and commanding. "Oh, come now, it's getting dull. We need some entertainment." A few people chuckled obligingly. Maya didn't look up. She arranged the tarts neatly. Then she felt the attention of the room shift. It was a physical sensation, like a draft. She glanced up and found Evelyn looking directly at her, a glittering, mischievous smile on her lips. It was not a friendly look. "You," Evelyn said, pointing a manicured finger. "The quiet one. You've been floating around all night like a little shadow." All conversation died. 50 pairs of eyes swiveled from Evelyn to Maya. Heat rushed to Maya's face. She felt frozen, the tray suddenly heavy in her hands. Evelyn took a slow sip of her wine, savoring the moment. "You look like the artistic type. All that solemnity." She waved her glass towards the majestic, silent piano. "That beautiful instrument is just dying for a tune. Why don't you grace us with something? Consider it a special service." A beat of silence hung in the air. Then a few scattered nervous titters came from the crowd. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, curious. They all understood the unspoken rule of the night. Evelyn was the queen, and this was a command performance designed for her amusement. The request was a trap, a way to underline the difference between them, the one who owned the piano and the one who served the canapes. Maya's mouth went dry. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. I really shouldn't," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper in the huge room. It sounded pathetic even to her own ears. "I'm working." Evelyn's smile widened. She had her prey right where she wanted her. "Nonsense. I insist. Everyone needs to earn their keep, darling. And it's just a bit of fun." She let the word "earn" hang in the air. "Unless," she added, her tone dropping to a mock-concerned purr, "you have stage fright? Or perhaps you don't know how." The cruelty was naked now. The challenge was public. Maya's eyes flickered towards her supervisor, a stern woman named Linda, who stood by the kitchen doorway. Linda's face was a mask of professional panic. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head that meant, asterisk, do not cause a scene. Do not embarrass the client. Asterisk, that was the final lock clicking into place. She couldn't refuse. To refuse would be to defy the hostess, to embarrass her employer, to make herself the story of the party for all the wrong reasons. The only path forward was through the humiliation. With a slow, deep breath that did nothing to calm her nerves, Maya set the heavy tray of tartlets down on a side table. The action felt final, like disarming herself. A path cleared through the crowd as she walked towards the piano. The sound of her sensible work shoes on the marble floor was deafening in the quiet room. She felt the weight of every stare, some pitying, some bored, most just hungry for the distraction of a little drama dot. She reached the piano. Up close, it was even more imposing. She pulled out the heavy bench, the scrape of its legs echoing. She sat down, her back straight and stiff against the audience. The closed lid of the piano stretched before her like a dark, still lake. For a long moment, she did nothing. She just stared at the blank, black wood. The room was so silent she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. She could feel Evelyn's triumphant gaze burning into her back. This was the pause the hostess wanted, the evidence of the waitress's terror. Maya's hands, which had been steady all night carrying trays, now trembled slightly. She lifted them and placed them gently in her lap, out of sight. She closed her eyes. The images that came were not of this cold, judging room, but of a sunlit living room, smaller and full of books. The sound was not silence, but the rich, warm notes of a well-loved upright piano, and a voice, soft and encouraging, saying, "Just feel it, my love. Let the music speak what you can't." A strange calm settled over her. The panic didn't leave, but it was joined by something else, something deeper and older. She opened her eyes. There was no smile on her face, only a grave focus. She reached out, lifted the heavy fallboard to reveal the ivory and ebony keys. They gleamed, waiting. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Evelyn. She looked only at the keys, as if they were a map, and she was remembering the way home. Her fingers, no longer trembling, found their starting positions, and in the breathless silence of the glass-walled penthouse, she began to play. The walk to the piano felt like the longest journey of her life. The room, so vast and open just moments before, now felt like a narrow tunnel. The faces of the guests blurred into a smear of color and expectant eyes. Her own breathing was loud in her ears, a ragged counter-rhythm to the soft tap of her shoes on the floor dot. She was aware of everything in painful detail. The cool, smooth surface of a champagne flute on a tray she passed. The faint, citrusy scent of someone's cologne. The low murmur of a voice that wasn't quite hushed enough. "This is cruel." Another voice, closer, whispered back, "Evelyn's in a mood tonight." Maya kept her gaze fixed on the piano. It was her only landmark in this sea of awkwardness. She could feel the heat of a blush burning up her neck and into her cheeks, a telltale sign of her shame that she couldn't control. She wished, desperately, that the floor would open up and swallow her. But it didn't. The marble was solid and unyielding beneath her feet dot as she neared the instrument. Its size became truly intimidating. It wasn't furniture. It was a presence. The polished black wood reflected the room in a distorted, wavy mirror, showing her own approaching figure small, dark, out of place. She reached it and for a second just stood there, her hand hovering over the bench. The silence in the room was now absolute and heavy, like a thick blanket smothering all sound. She pulled the bench out. The sound it made, a low, gritty scrape, was horribly loud. She winced inwardly. She sat, the leather cool through her thin uniform skirt. The piano keyboard stretched before her, a landscape of white and black. It had been so long. Over 2 years. Her fingers, which knew the weight of trays and the feel of dishwater, felt clumsy and foreign. She could sense the audience holding its collective breath. This was the moment they were waiting for. The fumble, the clumsy chopsticks melody, the nervous giggle and the hurried apology. This was the punchline to Evelyn's joke. Maya placed her hands lightly on the keys. They were cool and smooth. She pressed one middle C softly. The note was pure and resonant, a single clear drop of sound in the silent room. It seemed to hang in the air for a second before fading. The action, simple as it was, sparked something. A muscle memory deeper than embarrassment, older than this job. She closed her eyes again, shutting out the mirrored reflection of the watching crowd. She didn't see Evelyn, who had folded her arms, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. She didn't see the older gentleman by the bookcase, who was watching with a slight frown of concern. She didn't see her supervisor, Linda, who had her hand over her own eyes, peeking through her fingers, as if watching a car crash. Instead, Maya went inward. She thought of her mother's hands. They were slender and strong, with clever fingers that could make a simple scale sound like a poem. She heard her mother's voice, not from a memory of a lesson, but from a memory of comfort. It was a rainy afternoon, the world gray and soft outside the window. She had been a teenager, heartbroken over something silly and world-ending. She hadn't been able to speak about it. Her mother hadn't asked her to. She had just sat at their old, scuffed upright piano and begun to play something slow and complicated and full of a sadness that understood everything. "Listen," her mother had said softly, not stopping. "Some things don't need words. The music holds them for you. That piece, what was it?" Her mind, foggy with panic, scrabbled for it. Her fingers, resting on the keys, seemed to remember before her brain did. They shifted almost imperceptibly, settling into a familiar, haunting shape. In the audience, a woman stifled a cough. Someone shifted their weight. The party was waiting for its laugh. Maya took a breath, a deep one that filled her lungs and steadied the tremor in her shoulders. This wasn't for them. This wasn't for Evelyn. This was an escape, a way to be anywhere but here. She had been forced to this instrument, but they couldn't force what came out of it. That was hers. That had always been hers. Her shoulders dropped. The rigid line of her spine softened just a little. And then she began to play. The first few chords were not loud, but they were profound. They were deep, rich, somber notes that didn't skitter or hesitate. They bloomed in the air, low and resonant, vibrating through the floor and into the bones of the listeners. It was immediately, unmistakably, not the sound of an amateur. It was the sound of control, of deep feeling channeled through years of practice. The piece unfolded slowly, a melody of piercing sweetness wrapped in a cloak of deep sorrow. It was Chopin, the Nocturne in C-sharp minor. It was a piece about longing, about the memory of joy seen through the lens of loss. It was all the words she had never said about the empty space in her life, where her mother used to be. The change in the room was instant and electric. The atmosphere of amused anticipation shattered like glass. Eyebrows, raised in mockery, now lifted in genuine surprise. Smirks vanished, replaced by looks of shock. The financier who had been checking his watch froze, his hand in midair. The gallery owner who had been discussing prices felt her breath catch. The young man who had been bored all evening suddenly found himself leaning forward, his eyes wide. Maya was no longer in the penthouse. She was in that old, sunlit room. The keys under her fingers were the slightly yellowed ivory of her mother's piano. The scent in the air was of old books and coffee, not perfume and caviar. Her body moved with the music, a gentle sway that was unconscious, natural. Her face, reflected dimly in the piano's fallboard, was not the face of a humiliated waitress. It was the face of someone immersed in a private, powerful conversation. Her eyes were closed, her expression one of deep concentration and a sadness so real it was almost tangible. The music swelled, filled with cascading notes that sounded like tears, then fell to whispers that felt like secrets. There was no sheet music to follow. This was played by heart, by muscle, by soul. Every pause was deliberate, every crescendo earned. It was a story, and she was telling it without saying a single word. Evelyn's arms slowly unfolded. The smug smile had melted from her face, leaving behind a blank mask of confusion that quickly began to harden into something else, the dawning, cold understanding that she had made a terrible miscalculation. This was not a joke. This was an unveiling. And she was not the director of the scene anymore. She was just another audience member, and a stunned one at that. Her eyes darted around the room, seeing the captivated faces, seeing her own power over the evening dissolve note by note. Her plan to elevate herself by lowering another had backfired spectacularly. A hot flush, different from Maya's blush of shame, crept up her own neck. This was the blush of profound embarrassment. The final notes came, a series of soft, descending chords that didn't so much end as fade into the air, leaving a residue of beautiful sadness hanging in the silence. Maya's hands came to rest back in her lap. The last vibration from the strings faded away, and for the second time that night, the room was completely, utterly silent. But this was a different silence. It wasn't the silence of anticipation or mockery. It was the stunned, respectful silence that follows something real, something that touches the core of people who thought they were just there for a party. No one clapped. No one moved. They were all still caught in the world the music had built, afraid that a single sound would break the spell. Maya slowly opened her eyes. She was back in the glass room. The weight of the silence pressed on her. She didn't turn around. She just stared at her own hands, resting quietly on the black and white keys, wondering what would happen next. The silence after the final note was thicker than the one before she played. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was heavy with the weight of what everyone had just heard. For a few seconds, no one even seemed to breathe. The only movement was the distant, silent pulse of the city lights through the windows. Maya kept her eyes on her hands. They felt light now, almost disconnected from her body. The storm of memory and music that had roared through her was gone, leaving her feeling hollow and exposed. She was intensely aware of the 50 people sitting behind her, frozen. She waited for the sound she was sure would come next. A single, slow clap from Evelyn, sarcastic and dismissive, cutting through the tension. She braced for it, but it didn't come. Instead, a sound broke the quiet that made her flinch. It was a soft, choked sob. It came from the left side of the room. Maya dared a glance at the piano's reflection. It was the woman in the green dress, the one who had been staring out the window earlier. She had a hand pressed to her mouth, her shoulders trembling slightly. A single tear traced a line through her makeup. That single? Human sound seemed to unlock the room. A man near the back, a stout fellow with glasses, who had been talking loudly about property investments all night, let out a long, slow breath, he seemed to have been holding. "Wow," he whispered, the word carrying in the stillness. Then, from the right, near the bookcase, came a different sound. A firm, solid clap. Not a patter, but a single, deliberate clap. Then another. Maya turned her head. Just slightly. It was the older gentleman. He had white hair and a kind, lined face. He wasn't looking at her with pity or shock. He was looking at her with a profound, deep respect. His eyes were bright. He continued to clap, slow and steady, his gaze locked on her. His solitary applause was the spark. Another person joined, then another. It wasn't the wild, cheering applause of a concert hall. It was something more earnest, more grateful. It started soft, then grew, filling the room with a warm, rushing sound that was the complete opposite of the cruel silence from before. People were getting to their feet. The gallery owner was nodding, clapping fiercely, a look of astonishment still on her face. The bored young man was actually smiling. Maya turned fully on the bench, facing them. The sight was overwhelming. All these polished, wealthy strangers were on their feet, applauding her. The waitress. The punchline. Her vision blurred slightly. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. Confusion swirled with the last dregs of her adrenaline. She looked for Evelyn. The hostess was still standing by the window, where she had been holding court. She was not clapping. Her arms were crossed again, but this time it didn't look like a posture of power. It looked like she was holding herself together. The color had drained from her face, leaving her carefully applied makeup looking stark and unnatural. She was staring at Maya, but not seeing the uniform anymore. She was seeing the person who had just come out of it. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been the first flicker of shame. The older gentleman, the one who had started the applause, stepped forward. He moved through the standing guests until he was at the front, near the piano. The clapping began to die down as people saw he wanted to speak. He had a quiet authority that commanded attention. He looked at Maya, his voice gentle but clear enough for the hushed room to hear. "That was one of the most heartfelt renditions of that piece I have ever heard," he said. His voice had a soft, educated accent. The dynamics, the phrasing in the middle section, it wasn't just technical. You made it speak. Maya looked down at her lap again, unused to such direct, kind attention. "Thank you," she murmured. "Where did you study?" He asked. There was no suspicion in his voice, only genuine curiosity. I didn't, not formally." Maya's voice was a little stronger now. She swallowed. "My mother was a pianist. She taught me." "Ah," he said, the sound full of understanding. "A teacher of great sensitivity, then." "It shows. What is her name?" "I know many in the musical world. Perhaps I have heard of her." This was the question she always dreaded, the one that led to the inevitable. She took a shaky breath. The room was still listening, completely captivated by this unexpected turn in the evening's drama. "Her name was Alina," Maya said quietly. Then, before the gentleman could ask the next logical question, she added, "She passed away 2 years ago." A soft, collective sigh seemed to move through the crowd. The woman in the green dress let out another small sob. The pieces clicked into place for everyone. The depth of the sorrow in the music. The young woman's quietness. This wasn't just a performance. It had been a public glimpse into a private grief, one they had all forced her to share. The old gentleman's face softened even further. He nodded slowly. "I am so very sorry for your loss. She left a beautiful part of herself here, in you. That piece, you played it not like a student, but like someone who has lived its meaning." He paused, then asked, almost delicately, "Do you play often? Professionally?" Maya gave a small, sad shake of her head. She looked at her hands, The waitress's hands. No, I haven't played for anyone since she died. It was our thing. It felt too hard to do it alone. She glanced around at the grand piano, the party, the faces. I haven't even touched a piano in over 2 years. This admission created another layer of awe in the room. The performance wasn't just skilled. It was a miracle of muscle memory and emotion, pulled from a deep, locked-away place. The gentleman was silent for a moment, absorbing this. He looked from Maya to Evelyn, who was still statue-still by the window. His gaze was not accusatory, but it was heavy with meaning. He looked back at Maya. "Thank you," he said sincerely, his voice thick. "Thank you for sharing that with us." Even if. He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew what he meant. Even if the circumstances that brought it out were so wrong, his words broke it down. People began to move forward, not in a rush, but slowly, respectfully. The gallery owner approached. "That was breathtaking," she said, her voice earnest. "Truly, I have a space. We have intimate concerts sometimes. If you ever." She fished a business card from her clutch and placed it gently on the corner of the piano. A couple came up, the man looking awkward but impressed. "Yeah, incredible," he said. "Just incredible." For the next 10 minutes, Maya sat on the piano bench, the center of a quiet, buzzing circle. The mood of the party had completely transformed. The talk was no longer of deals and gossip, but of music, of feeling, of the unexpected moment that had stunned them all. People asked gentle questions, not prying, but wanting to understand. They spoke to her as an artist, as a person. The uniform she wore became invisible to them. Through it all, she was aware of Evelyn. The hostess had not moved from her spot. She watched the scene unfold around her piano, around her waitress. Her party had been stolen, but not out of spite. It had been lifted from her by something she didn't understand and couldn't control. The expression on her face slowly shifted from shock to a deep, uncomfortable pensiveness. She was watching a young woman receive the sincere admiration she herself often commanded but rarely, perhaps truly earned. She uncrossed her arms and picked up her wine glass, but didn't drink from it. She just held it, looking isolated in her own home. Maya finally stood up, the movement causing a slight hush. I should get back to work," she said softly, though the concept felt absurd now. Her supervisor, Linda, appeared at the edge of the group. Her face was a picture of flustered confusion. No, it's fine," Linda stammered, completely out of her depth. "Take a moment." But Maya needed to move. She needed to do something normal. She gave a small, polite nod to the people around her and made her way back toward the kitchen, the crowd parting for her once more. This time, the looks were not of pity or amusement, but of something close to reverence. As she passed the long table where the empty trays were collected, she didn't look at Evelyn, but she felt the woman's eyes following her every step. The weight of that gaze was different now. It wasn't the weight of a superior looking down. It was the confused, heavy weight of someone who has just realized they have severely underestimated the world and their place in it. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. The grand house, which was usually a place of subtle activity cleaners, gardeners, cooks going about their business, felt muffled. The staff spoke in lower voices around Leo. They had all heard the story, of course. They had heard the music from the kitchen door. They had seen Alara leave. They looked at their employer differently now, not with fear, but with a kind of careful watchfulness. He had crossed a line they all understood, and it had blown up in his face. The master was no longer a figure of untouchable authority, but a man who had made a very human and very cruel mistake. Leo tried to go back to his normal life. He had meetings in his polished office. He made phone calls about investments and properties. He ate meals prepared by his excellent chef, but nothing felt normal. The memory of the music was like a ghost in every room. He would be reading a report and suddenly hear a phrase of that haunting prelude in his mind. He would look out the window and see not the garden, but her face as she played, lost in a world of memory and pain. He found himself walking into the grand room often. He would just stand there and look at the piano. It wasn't a trophy anymore. It was a monument to his own ignorance. He had bought it to impress people, to own a piece of beauty. But he had never understood beauty, not really. He only understood price tags and prestige. She had shown him the difference. About a week after the party, Mrs. Thorne, the music critic, called. She was polite but direct. "I am writing a small piece," she said. "Not a gossip column. A reflection on the nature of art and where we sometimes find it. Your evening will be a part of it. The names will be changed, but the story will be recognizable. I thought you should know." Leo didn't argue. He just said, "I see." He knew he deserved it. The story was out there anyway, spreading through the city in whispers. This would just make it official in certain circles. His humiliation would be complete, written down in black and white. He found he didn't even care about that part anymore. The private humiliation, the one he felt inside, was so much heavier. The true weight was the understanding of what he had taken from her. He had forced a woman who associated the piano with the worst loss of her life to perform for a crowd of strangers. He had treated a deep personal wound as public entertainment. He kept thinking about her words. Asterisk, you wanted a performance. You got one. Asterisk, she had given him exactly what he asked for, and in doing so, showed him how cheap his request had been. One afternoon, he couldn't stand the silence of the house anymore. He told his driver he wouldn't be needed and went for a walk. He didn't go to his usual clubs or parks. He walked without direction, through parts of the city he usually only saw from the inside of a car. The noise and the life of the streets were a strange comfort. He found himself outside a small old music school. It was a modest brick building, nothing like the grand conservatories he donated to. Through an open window on the ground floor, he could hear the clumsy, earnest sounds of children practicing scales. A wrong note here, a fumbled rhythm there. It was the sound of learning, of trying. It was nothing like the flawless, heartbreaking perfection Elara had produced, and that was when it hit him fully. That perfection had come from a lifetime of work. From years of that same kind of clumsy practice as a child, of sacrifice, of a rare gift being nurtured by a strict teacher. It had come from love for the music, and it had all been shattered in one night of smoke and tragedy. The piano had gone from being her voice to being a tombstone for her old life, and he had forced her to sit at it and perform seances with her own past. He turned and walked back home, the sounds of the children's piano fading behind him. His mind was made up. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't bring back her teacher or her career. He couldn't erase the fire or his own actions. But the one thing he had, the one ugly thing he had done, was to use his power to make her perform. He could never take that back. But he could try, in some small, useless way, to do the opposite. When he got back to the house, he went to his study. He took out a piece of his heavy, expensive stationery and a pen. He stared at the blank page for a long time. Then he began to write. He didn't write an apology. Apologies were for the person who made them, to feel better. He wrote a letter of reference, but not the kind she had refused. He wrote that Elara, whose full name he now carefully wrote as Elara Venskaya, had been in his employ. He wrote that she was a person of the highest integrity, remarkable strength, and unimaginable talent. He wrote that any employer would be fortunate to have her, and that her past in no way diminished her character, but rather spoke of her resilience. He signed it with his full name and title, a name that carried weight in the city. Then he did something else. He contacted his lawyer. He had a new clause added to his will. The Bissendorfer piano was to be donated, not to a museum or a university, but to a small, specific community music school in a part of the city that couldn't afford such an instrument. The only condition was that it be used to teach children for free. He didn't put Ilara's name in the document. But he knew. It was a monument, not to his shame anymore, but to the beauty she had shown him existed, and to the idea that such beauty should be a gift, not a command. He never tried to find her. He knew she didn't want to be found by someone like him. The letter of reference was sent to the agency through which she had been hired, with a note asking them to forward it if she ever got in touch. He didn't know if she would. He hoped she would find her quiet job far from the city. He hoped she would find some pieced out life in the big house, settled into a new rhythm. The party was never spoken of again. Leo still hosted events, but they were quieter, less about show. He listened more than he spoke. He sometimes thought he saw a flicker of surprise in the eyes of old friends, a sense that the sharp, bored edge he used to have was gone, sanded down by something they couldn't aim. And sometimes, late in the evening when the house was silent, he would sit in the grand room. He wouldn't play the piano. He never learned. He would just sit and look at it. The memory of the music she had played was no longer a sting. It was a sad, beautiful thing that lived in the air. He had compelled the maid to play to humiliate her. And she had played. And in doing so, she hadn't just stunned the audience. She had, in the end, changed the man who had given the command. Not completely, not into a hero, but into someone who could, finally, hear the silence after the music and understand what it meant. The party didn't end right away. How could it? The guests had too much to talk about. The shock had worn off, replaced by a buzzing, thrilling excitement. The story was perfect. It had everything hidden talent, a dramatic fall from grace, a rich man's blunder, and a stunning, beautiful comeback. They huddled in groups, sipping their wine with new energy, replaying the moment, dissecting the music, and sharing what little they knew about the tragic fire and the vanished prodigy, Ilara Venskaya. Leo's grand soirée, meant to showcase his latest possession, had become her stage. And he was just a character in her story, the foolish aristocrat who had accidentally set the scene for her return. He could hear the murmurs through the study door. His name was in their mouths, mixed with laughs that were no longer polite but knowing. He was the punchline. He stayed in his study for a long time, listening to the distant sounds of his own party. He didn't move. The weight of what he'd done sat on him like a heavy coat. He thought about going out there, trying to regain control, to act like it was all a clever surprise he had planned. But the lie was too big. No one would believe it. He had looked as stunned as everyone else. More so. Finally, the sounds began to fade. The goodbyes were called out. Car engines purred to life on the gravel drive. The house slowly emptied, returning to its usual nighttime quiet, but it felt different now. It felt like the walls themselves had heard the music and were holding their breath. When the last guest was gone, and the only sounds were the soft clinking from the kitchen as the staff cleaned up, Leo finally left his study. He didn't go to the main room. He walked down the long tiled corridor toward the servants' quarters. His shoes made a sharp, lonely sound on the floor. He didn't really know what he was going to say. "I'm sorry," felt like a pebble thrown into a deep canyon. It meant nothing, but he had to see her. He had to try. He found the housekeeper, a kind, no-nonsense woman, putting away linens. She looked up, her face carefully blank. She had heard everything, of course. The entire staff had. "Where is she?" Leo asked, his voice sounding rough, unused. The housekeeper hesitated. "In her room, sir." "She's packing." The words hit him like a blow. Of course, packing. Why would she stay? He gave a short nod and walked to the small plain door at the end of the hall. He knocked, not with his usual firm rap, but softly. There was a pause. Then the door opened just a crack. Elara stood there. She had changed out of the black maid's dress into a simple, worn skirt and blouse. Her face was clean of any expression, wiped smooth like a slate, but her eyes were red-rimmed, even though they were dry. Behind her, on the narrow bed, he could see a small, worn suitcase, open and half-filled with her few belongings. They looked at each other. For a moment, neither spoke. The distance between them, the width of the doorway, the difference in their clothes, the whole world of money and status that usually separated them felt meaningless now. Something else hung in the air between them. Something real and raw and uncomfortable. "You were Elara Venskaya," Leo said finally. It wasn't a question. It was him stating a fact he was still struggling to believe. She didn't deny it. She just looked at him, waiting. There was no anger in her face. That might have been easier. There was just a deep, exhausted resignation. I didn't know," he said, the words feeling weak even as he said them. A flicker of something passed over her face, not surprise, but a kind of sad understanding. "Of course you didn't," she said. Her voice was quiet, but steady. It was the same voice that had whispered, "I cannot play," but now it held no fear. It was empty. "People like you don't ask maids about their pasts." He flinched. She wasn't being cruel. She was just telling the truth. He had never seen her as a person with a history, only as a function. A pair of hands to clean. "Stay," he heard himself say. The word came out without him planning it. "The piano. It should be played. Like you played it. It shouldn't just sit there." For the first time, a real emotion showed in her eyes. It was a flash of something like bitter amusement. "You wanted a performance," she said. "You got one. That's all it was. A performance for your party. It's over now." It wasn't just a performance, he argued, but it sounded hollow. That was real. That was art. She shook her head slowly. She turned away from the door and went back to folding a plain gray sweater, placing it carefully in the suitcase. "That was a ghost," she said, her back to him. "A ghost you ordered to dance for your friends." Elara Venskaya lived for the music. She lived for the applause, for the stage. She died in that fire with her teacher. What you saw tonight, that was just a memory, a reflex. "This," she said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at herself, "this is what's left. Someone who needs to work. Someone who needs quiet." Leo stood in the doorway, feeling more shut out than if she had slammed the door in his face. He was a man who solved problems with money, with influence. He could offer her a salary 10 times what she made. He could offer her the piano, teachers, a concert. He could try to buy her a new career, to fix the past, but looking at her, at the careful, weary way she packed her few things, he knew it was worthless. You couldn't buy back a life. You couldn't pay away trauma. His money, his world, had nothing she wanted. In fact, his world was the one that had just caused her more pain. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice low. She finished closing the suitcase and clicked the latches shut. The sound was final. "I'll find another job. A quieter one. Maybe farther from the city." She turned and faced him again, picking up her coat and her small bag. She was ready to go. "Our contract is finished, I think. You won't need to provide a reference." It was a dismissal. She, the maid, was dismissing him, the master of the house. And he had no ground to stand on. He had broken the unspoken contract first. He stepped back, out of her way, into the dim hallway. She walked out of the room, suitcase in hand. She didn't look at him again. She walked down the corridor, past the kitchen, where a few other staff members peeked out with wide, solemn eyes, and out the back door into the cool night. Leo didn't follow her. He stood there in the empty hallway, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade away on the gravel path, and then to the soft click of the garden gate. He was alone. The grand house, which usually felt like a symbol of his power, now felt like a giant, empty shell. The silence was complete. But it was not peaceful. It was the silence after a storm, full of wreckage. He had thought he was giving a command. He had thought he was putting on a show. But he had been the one who was shown something. He had been shown a glimpse of a real person, with a real tragedy and a real staggering gift. And in his ignorance and his boredom, he had tried to use it as a toy. He walked slowly back through his quiet, perfect house, back to the grand room. The party debris was being cleared. The Bissendorfer piano sat in the moonlight, streaming through the tall windows. It looked majestic and completely silent. He walked over and touched the lid, his fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood dot he had compelled the maid to play to humiliate her. And she had played. And in doing so, she had given him, and everyone in his world, a humiliation far deeper than any he could have planned. She had shown them all the smallness of their games, compared to the vastness of real feeling, of real art, of a real broken human heart. The joke, it turned out, had always been on him. The final, crushing note of the evening was his to carry, alone in his beautiful, silent house.